to our third live link up from COP30 in Belém in Brazil. My name is Lee Morris. I'm Director of International for the Wildlife Trust. Today I'm going to be joined by two people. First of all, Bethan Lachlan, who's the Senior Policy Specialist at the Zoological Society of London, ZSL. Bethan's been on the first two calls with us from Belém. She's still out in Brazil. We spoke to her on day one, and then we spoke to her in week two, and it's going to be great to get her reflections at the end now of what's been a very interesting 2 weeks in Belém. Alongside Bethan, I'm delighted to welcome Catherine Brown, who's Director of Climate Change and Evidence at the Wildlife Trust. And Catherine leads currently our climate work for the Wildlife Trust, highly regarded as a climate expert, and she's about to take up a new role next year as Science Director at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Sad for us, but still great for our sector that she's going into that. Will be a really fantastic role for her, and Catherine's attended previous COP. So it's brilliant to have these two here today. I'm going to ask the questions. Please, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat and I'll try and pick up on them. So welcome both of you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Lee.
We'll start with you, Bethan. You're still out in Brazil. I'm going to ask you to tell us exactly where you are now, post-COP.
Yes, I decided to stay here in Brazil and see a little bit more of the Amazon. It felt like an opportunity not to be missed. So
I think we may have a link-up problem.
town, which I arrived. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, Bethan, it's okay. It's genuine connection issues. Try that one again. Give us where are you?
Okay. Am I back for you?
Yeah, I've got you, Bethan. You broke up a little bit, and we'll just call that the challenges of a live link
to the Amazon to see a little bit of it, and as you can imagine, it's not very good. So let's see what we can do with my shoddy connection. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's okay. You're actually out in the rainforest now. I know that, and you saw a tarantula earlier today. So thank you for making the link work. So let's start with highlights. Let's start from highlights from what you saw in Belém, and then Catherine, I'll bring you in for highlights from afar. So Bethan, what were your highlights of the 2 weeks at COP30?
Yeah, I think the COP ended probably not in a way that we were pushing for ambition-wise when it comes to nature and the specific textual outcomes. But I think a massive highlight for me is how we've moved from nature being very much at the margins to it being far more at the centre of the negotiations. We've seen that with the TFFF launching, we've seen that with specific negotiations around cooperation, we've seen it with negotiations on deforestation. So although the outcomes are not quite the level of ambition and pushing that we wanted, I think a massive highlight for me is seeing that transformation, which is really quite profound. Thank you.
And before I bring Catherine in, we all watched the news back here in the UK of the fire. So something like that does bring COP30 to the attention of masses. So were you near to the fire? How much did that impact on your experience at the COP?
Yeah, so I was fairly close, but the venue's so enormous that actually it was a really bad fire, but it was in one contained area of the venue, and very thankfully, thanks to the fire brigade coming incredibly quickly. I think they were with us within 6 minutes. It was put out very fast, but no, it brought everything to a standstill for essentially a day. It happened around 1 p.m. There was a full evacuation of the site. We were very well cared for, but yes, we did lose quite a lot of time negotiations-wise. I think, however, and this is going to sound a bit sappy, but I do want to say it, I think what we did see though was an enormous amount of people in this sector caring for each other. There was this emergency. This has never happened to me during my time at a COP. I don't think it's happened to many others. So the fact that everyone literally looked after each other and getting them out the building as fast as possible, regardless of country or position or anything like that, was quite moving. And nobody was hurt. Thankfully, there was some emergency service people who needed some additional oxygen, but other than that, we're not aware of anybody being hurt. So a very quite stressful afternoon, but we're okay.
Good. Right, let me bring Catherine in. So Catherine, I know you've been watching things from afar with interest. What's your take on the success of COP30?
Yeah, thank you, Lee. And yeah, we were all texting Bethan while that fire was unfolding as well, because I've certainly been flooded at a COP before and certainly had extreme heat, but the fire was really quite unprecedented and did push things back a little bit. Actually, I was expecting it to end later than it did. I was expecting there to be a little bit more pressure to agree a stronger text at the end, and what we observed was actually it wrapped up quite quickly, obviously over time, which COPs always go over time. But yeah, I was pretty disappointed, to be honest. And as Bethan says, you know, we've seen some glimmers about nature and its role in the climate text, and I know there were some interesting advances on adaptation, which is very close to my heart, as my colleagues will know, and it was good to see that they'd managed to agree certainly the indicator framework and actually a much more ambitious text on financing for adaptation, particularly in developing countries. But in the cover text, the kind of the summary text at the end, that was the real push that the presidency was trying to push. We didn't see a huge amount on nature. We didn't see a huge amount on climate science, and this has really upset a lot of our colleagues in the climate science world, who were really having to battle even to get references to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change back into the text at the end to say that this was the best available science and we should be heeding it, and they did manage that. But it was a real battle. And I think there wasn't as much attention as we would like on the fact that we are in a really different world now, that we've seen record after record being broken over the last 12 months, and that we really need to be acting much, much faster to avoid some of these horrendous tipping point effects, including for the Amazon, that a lot of people were talking about in great detail during the COP. So in that sense, it was disappointing, but I think it does reflect the global mood, obviously, at the moment, where multilateralism and geopolitics is really coming under strain, and we're seeing a lot of very difficult situations around the world.
So I've not been to COPs. I'm learning so much from this and from interactions with you and Bethan and the others in the team. So this was billed as the nature COP. It was all exciting. It was the forest COP. It was going to be transformational in bringing the climate and nature narratives together. From the UK watching, how successful has that been?
I would say from the UK perspective, watching it from the outside, it wasn't very successful, but I'd really like to know what Bethan thinks, because I think she saw a lot more of the detail. The TFFF, the tropical forest facility, you know, that was the early announcement. That was very well received. The UK weren't taking part at that point, but we understand that's because of the timing around the budget. We may see some movement on that after the budget is out, so maybe in a couple of weeks' time. But really, if you look at just the text itself, there isn't a huge amount. And I've seen more in previous COPs. Certainly the Glasgow COP had more attention to nature in the text than this one has. But actually, I'd really like to know what Bethan thinks, because I know she was keeping a close eye, you know, in the room and actually listening to the discussions happening.
Let's bring Bethan in. Bethan, was it a nature COP?
It was nearly a nature COP, I think is the way I would say it. There was a real significant shift from week 1 to week 2, actually even from sort of the start of week 2 to the end of week 2. The presidency were really pushing for these roadmaps, which were essentially going to be not just the what of how do we tackle deforestation and climate change, but the how. Because up till now, these negotiations have been very focused on the what. And now, as I've spoken about before, as we enter this era of implementation, we have to be thinking about the how. And so there was this proposal for these 2 roadmaps, a transition away from fossil fuels roadmap and a deforestation roadmap that for a good long while looked like they were going to make it in. But sadly, what we got was what they call a diminutive text. So it was a text that was it was good at the beginning, and then a diminutive one came out that was quite low ambition, and that saw the removal of those two roadmaps, which meant that in this big cover decision, what we had was quite a little bit of reference to nature in what's called the preambular paragraphs, so sort of the introductory paragraphs. But when it came to the operational, to the meaningful, to the decision, we saw no reference to the term fossil fuels, which I think is really important to reference, especially from the scientific perspective, as Catherine's just raised, and no actionable language on deforestation or climate and biodiversity synergies within the text itself, which is really disappointing because it was very, very close. But this is a consensus-based process. And it was clear that there was not going to be consensus. It seemed to be a pretty strong split. There seemed to be about 80 countries in favour of the roadmaps, and then the rest not in favour. And that is not tenable for a consensus-based process. However, I think that number is important to remember, because if you've got 80 countries looking for a fossil fuel roadmap and 80 countries looking for a deforestation roadmap, that's a hell of a lot of countries, and that can grow with time. Those numbers might be slightly off, by the way. I can't quite remember the exact numbers, but it was around 80 to 90. Yeah.
So I'm also disappointed by the fact that fossil fuels weren't mentioned, but I'm going to try and stay half full on this. So what hope is there? Because there was an agreement signed, so
yep.
Everyone did get consensus on a piece of paper at the end and signed it. So what bits of hope, what baby steps are there in that agreement that move us forward? Beth first, and then we'll go to Catherine for that.
Thanks. Yes, it's important to remember this isn't just one agreement. A lot of focus is on the muturao, the so-called sort of cover text, but there were dozens and dozens of agenda items passed. I'll start with the good things. I think the passage of the we haven't spoken about this before, but I will raise it because I think it really matters. The passage of the Gender Action Plan is really significant. There was also a really significant decision on what's known as the just transition. So how do we support countries and communities are very reliant on fossil fuel-based economies and fossil fuel-based jobs to move into the renewable economy. Really important from a justice perspective. And then also, I think from a nature perspective, what we saw was, although we didn't see the decision text that we wanted, I think what we did see was a fundamental shift in nature being at the table, which was quite significant, because what we've discussed before is that there's no space for it. Countries weren't that interested. Now, it's still not enough. We still don't have nature as a red line for enough parties to fight for it. But it is a really significant transition. And I think that the example I'll give is in the cooperation item, which is the item I've spoken to you about before on climate and biodiversity synergies. What we had, unfortunately, was a final text that represented the sort of common lowest denominator of ambition. And again, consensus-based process. But what we did see across all of those negotiating sessions, of which there were 5 1 to 2 hour negotiating sessions, was the absolute vast majority of parties in that room wanted an ambitious text. They wanted something that really transformed the way we do climate and nature synergies. And although we didn't get the text because a very small number of parties didn't want it, and consensus-based process means that has to be respected, it was a fundamental transformation in the way parties talk about this topic, even in the last 6 months. Like 6 months ago, this agenda item was non-existent. It existed, but was never opened, never used. And now we've had 5 full negotiating sessions. In fact, they had to move us to a bigger room, because there was so much interest, they had to move us to this massive room. So I think it's important to recognise that we didn't get the text that we wanted, but it is also important to recognise that we've now, I think, officially moved from nature being on the margins to at the table, which I think should be celebrated, at the same time as being really disappointing that we didn't get the sort of legal textual elements that we wanted.
Thank you. And Catherine, can you give us hope on the baby steps? And also, I think what Bethan's last comments leads me into this consensus approach, this multilateral, we've all got to agree to move it forward. Is that working? Do we need to look at different tactics? Is that just one thing, but we need to do other things? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we are very strong supporters of multilateralism in the Wildlife Trust and as ZSLR as well. They are very, very important processes for making sure that every country's voice is heard, and that for big decisions where we're talking about future target setting, particularly things like the Paris Agreement, multilateralism worked brilliantly well. You know, we've been basing a lot of domestic policy and domestic economics off the back of the Paris Agreement for 10 years now. In my view, having worked on COPs for 20 plus years, I think the implementation using consensus-based processes when you're doing implementation maybe doesn't work quite so well. And it was really positive to see how many countries wanted that fossil fuels transition roadmap process, you know, around 80 countries. Mm-hmm. And I know the Brazilian presidency, who they do carry on for a while now and into the next COP, they want to take that and see what they can do outside of the formal COP process on fossil fuels, and same on deforestation. So I think we should all be looking at that really closely to see what happens. And in addition, I would say that if you look in the detail of the text, there's definitely some positives. We were really pleased to see the progress the parties made on adaptation and indicators in particular. They started this process about 18 months ago, and I think they had thousands of indicators because they'd gone to every country and said, what are your indicators for measuring progress? And they have managed to get that down to a small list. And that's really important for countries like the UK and for us, because it gives us a basis on which to measure what we actually want to achieve on adaptation. That's been missing in the UK very strongly for 10 years. So I'm hoping to see a little bit more domestic ambition off the back of those sorts of processes. So that's been really positive. And I think, as Bethan said on nature, you know, next year we're going into another climate COP, but also a nature COP, a Convention on Biological Diversity COP at the same time. And hopefully we will see a bit more knitting together of the two processes to see what we can achieve.
I've just had a message from one of the team back at base. I'm not seeing these questions coming in, so I think if you can pop them in the bottom left corner of the screen, that would be fantastic. While they're doing
could
that,
I come in very briefly on adaptation as well, just very briefly?
Yeah, please, Bethan.
Yeah. Adaptation was the one I missed from my list, so thank you so much, Catherine. I think I absolutely agree with everything Catherine said. I think there's two things to add, though. The first is that we have a new adaptation finance target, which was essentially one of the massive areas of division at this COP. We had a previous target of doubling, which was which expired in 2025, so doubling of adaptation finance, and now we have a tripling. So it's not perfect, but it's a real step forward and shows a dedication to the topic. But I think what we saw as well was, although the indicators are now broadly concluded, the final text did see them get, I think the technical term is somewhat hodgepodged. They got sort of like some of them got blended together, some of the technical elements got a bit confusing. So there's a very large sort of technical exercise to do at the moment on trying to understand exactly what these indicators are saying, what the technical work is going to be next. However, it is a really positive thing that we've concluded this indicator work in this way. It will continue for a few years, this sort of technical element. But to have countries agree a set of international indicators to measure adaptation has never been done before and should be celebrated. And there are indicators that include measuring nature as well, which is really important. I think what we need to do now is just sit down and analyse the text in a lot of detail, because we didn't have much time. We had like a day on the ground at COP because the text got released very late. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I need to say hello to Erica, Denise, Jane, Sheila and Peter, apparently. So hello to them. There is a question that's come in. Bethan, I'll fire this one for you. So on the ground, the question we've got pinged into us was those that disagreed with this nature narrative, did they give any reasons for their disagreement?
It's an excellent question, because it's sometimes quite hard to tell. So in the synergies discussions, in the climate and nature synergies discussions, part of it was that some parties felt they hadn't had enough time. So like I said to you before, this agenda item has only really been reinvigorated in the last 6 months. So some parties felt that wasn't enough time for them to build up a strong enough position or thoughts or that kind of thing. I personally didn't find that particularly compelling as an argument because they had 6 months and there was a consultation opportunity and a range of factors there. Others were sort of concerned around what it meant for the mandate. So what I mean by that is you've got these 3 conventions, land, nature and climate, and they are sort of legally separate entities, but obviously need to be thought about in an integrated way. So what does that mean? Legally, procedurally, that was raised a few times. And then I think the third reason is one that wasn't said in the room, but I will say it here because I think it's important, is that we know that if you can synergize implementation, you can make implementation more effective. And it is fair to say that some parties that I will not name are pushing for slower implementation and less effective implementation. And those views were present in the room. They weren't said that openly, but that was the undertone. Yeah, disappointing, but it's the reality you have to work with when you've got 190 plus countries all in the same space.
I've got a question around the parties who didn't support the inclusion of the words fossil fuels, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and manage this to 6 more minutes if I can, and I'm keen to get both your thoughts on what next for the UK and for ZSL and members of the Wildlife Trust and what we might do. But my perception in terms of the fossil fuels was it was the major nations producing fossil fuels that wouldn't agree to that text going in, and I believe that information's widely available. But what's the shortlist, Bethan?
Yes, I think that is the shortlist. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear Catherine's views on this as well, but yes, that is it. It's not only the major producers, but it's also sort of countries that are their economies are incredibly reliant on fossil fuels from a jobs creation perspective or from an exports creation perspective. I think the thing I will mention here, though, which I think matters, is that we do have language on like fossil fuels in previous decisions. We had it in Dubai, and we also had language on deforestation in Dubai at COP28. So it's not like this has never happened before, which is one of the reasons why the disappointment is so profound, is that you've got this, in some ways, backsliding on previous language. And one of the things that was so important about this COP is in Dubai, you had the global stocktake, which is very much the what of what do we need to do. And then this COP was going to be a lot about the how. So, and I think that is a real test of this process. And you asked about sort of reform and things before. And I think that's the test, right? Is you can't just have a process that only works for discussing the what. You have to have a process that works for discussing the how. That makes it all the more disappointing when you've got countries that have previously accepted text to now say that they're not happy with it, especially when it's something as simple as accepting the views of the IPCC or including language on fossil fuels, which we all know is like the absolute bare minimum. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Catherine, what's your thoughts? Are we going the right way? It's just slow, and these Saudi Arabias and Americas and Russias are going to eventually that text will come in next time or the one after?
Yeah, I mean, Saudi Arabia's been doing this for 20 years. They were doing it when I used to be in the negotiating team a long time ago. So none of that's new. Everyone attending COP is very used to those sorts of tactics. And as Bethan said, you know, really at the end of every COP, what we're interested in is what's going to happen. What's the action? So we've done the words now. We've had 2 weeks of words, and people spend inordinate amounts of time trying to agree the right words in the text in order to signal what the level of ambition is for all of us and for business and civil society to then act off the back of that. But we are acting. You know, we are all acting a lot at the moment on climate. The work of the Wildlife Trust, the work of ZSL, other UK environmental NGOs, global NGOs, global legal organisations, civil society organisations, indigenous organisations. There's a huge amount going on. So I think the real takeaway is at the end of any COP, yes, we've got the latest set of words, but look at the action that's happening. And although we are not where we need to be, and nobody would say that we were, global temperature is going up, emissions are still going up, although possibly at a slightly lower rate than they were. There's a huge amount of really positive stuff going on. And I would say to anybody following this process, look for the positives as well, see what you can do to support those positives, because we are getting increased traction for that, including, as Bethan said, around the links between nature and climate. Nature markets is a really interesting space at the moment, for example. And we need to be a lot louder about the role of nature in a post 1.5 degree world as well. So that's something I think all environmental NGOs and everyone working in this space should be thinking hard about over the next 12 months.
A question's come in the chat, which is probably the $6 gazillion billion question, is how do we curtail the fossil fuel lobby? If you've been doing this, 20 years ago and it was still there and it's there now, do you see that? How do we do that?
I mean, I would take a lot of the implementation stuff, and do it in those groups that were willing, the coalitions of the willing, the 80 countries that wanted that transition plan, start there and see how far you can get. That's what I would be doing.
I think it's worth noting as sorry, I think it's worth noting that as well, that there is increasingly these coalitions of the willing. Colombia have just announced they're going to be hosting the first meeting focused on fossil fuel phase out, which has never happened before. And I think also this increasing focus on nature will be present. The presidency have committed to pushing through roadmaps that weren't agreed in the text, but they're going to try and push them forward as a presidency priority. But I think sort of outside of that, it's also just really worth noting that the economy is already moving. The fossil fuel phase out is not happening as fast as it needs to, and yes, the politics always helps, like it makes everything easier, but we do know that the renewables economy, the low carbon economy, the nature positive economy is the fastest growing one. It's rapidly outpacing fossil fuels. So that's important to note when it's easy to become despondent, and believe me, like discussions around sort of finance and the economy are also really tricky, but it is important to note that it is working in that regard. It's just about pace, and how do we keep up the pace and not allow this misinformation to prevail around sort of like putting down the need for a rapid transition.
I'm going to give a last question to both of you. Beth, and I'll start with you and then finish with Catherine. And it's around what an individual could do. And I think that for me, it relates to what I've seen at COP from afar of civil society and Indigenous people, and the fact that they could walk down a street with a placard, and there seemed to be much more engagement. So that's giving people power. So give some hope or some inspiration to the individuals in the UK. What can they do? How can they make a difference?
Shall I go first?
Yeah,
Who wants to go
yes,
first?
Please. Sorry, Bethan. Yes.
Don't worry.
I'd stunned you both.
That's all right. I think for me, the thing that gets me through COPs and that gets me through any multilateral meeting, if it's climate or nature or whatever, is the civil society engagement. And it is the fact that you've got people there for 2+ weeks who are uncomfortable and tired, hot, it's so humid, and that there's flooding and fires, and yet they still come back. That people still come back and they're there out of will. And yes, multilateralism is difficult, but it's not dead. And the people at these, I think that's the thing to remember, is this decision was not optimal, but it was a decision. And we got there. It's not what we want it to be. And I think the piece of hope that I'd give, this is going to sound very sappy, very quickly, but bear with me, is that I sometimes get asked, like, oh, but it's just like a drop in an ocean. Like, what can we do? It's just a drop. To which I always say, this is a quote from one of my favorite books, which is that, like, yes, but what is an ocean if not a multitude of drops? And I see that in my colleagues at these COPs, and I love them because, like, that ability to work through the exhaustion, and Catherine will know this because she's lived it too. But just that reminder that yes, it is a drop, but that's what oceans are made of. Yeah. Thanks,
Bethan. Catherine, any thoughts to inspire individuals in the UK what they might do, or to take hope from COP30?
Yeah, what Bethan said. Go find your friends. So go and find those who want to achieve the same thing. See what you can do together. See how we can work better together. There's loads of advice and information on our websites collectively that people can go and look at on climate and nature, how to take action for both. And to keep going. We haven't lost the battle yet. we're still in it. A lot of people have said that around COP30. I think that's really important to keep in mind. And there's a whole lot of decisions in the future which could go in a really positive direction. And we're seeing a huge transition globally to clean energy systems, and we need to make sure that the nature story is in that as well. So there's an awful lot of work to do, but people have an enormous amount of energy and persistence in this agenda. So we'll have to see what happens next year.
Thank you. I agree. I'm asking the questions, but I'm just going to say I agree. Not people and community are everything. Nothing can change without the backing of the people and community. So I'm going to thank both of them. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us today, and big thanks to Bethany, who's joined 3 of these from COP30 in Brazil and now in the rainforest. So I've certainly learned a lot from our 3 conversations. I hope others have as well. Thank you to everyone for watching, whether you're watching it live or on playback. Thanks to those that pinged questions in the chat. And yeah, very best wishes. And Bethany, enjoy your well-earned holiday. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.